Welcome everyone to another episode of Black Fashion History, the podcast that celebrates all of the beautiful contributions of Black people across the diaspora to the fashion industry. And of course, I'm your host, Taniqua Martin, and I am excited today because I'm going to be having a conversation with a very special and interesting person. So she is a curator, consultant, and fashion historian. And as a London-based curator, she specializes in African visual culture and fashion history. She's also the founder of African Style Archive, which is a platform dedicated to preserving, documenting, and celebrating African fashion history and its global influence. So everyone, welcome to the podcast, Tosin Adeosun.
Hi, thanks for having me, Taniqua.
Thanks for being here. So we are just going to jump right into it because I'm excited to have you share a little bit about your work and your background with my audience. So can you discuss what drew you to culture, art, and fashion history within the African diaspora?
I think for me, it's always been innate with me. I've always been interested in art and history and fashion and culture. I'm Nigerian, but I grew up in London. I think it just kind of organically happened where I always liked fashion, but I never wanted to work in a big fashion magazine or anything like that. I always kind of liked the intersection of art and fashion. I studied art history. I did media and communications as well. That was for my undergrad, and art history and museum curating was with photography was my master's degree. And then kind of naturally, as I was kind of learning and studying and doing my own research, it all kind of came together. And I was like, oh my God, I would love to learn more about African fashion history. And there was not many places to learn from. So that's kind of where it's kind of starts. Yeah, and that started from there where I was doing my own research, but it actually mostly started with looking at photography and visual culture, films. I did during my studies, I did modules on global cinema where I was introduced to the works of Ousmane Sembène and Senegalese filmmakers. So I kind of already, all those visual culture references just started adding up. And then I just had a moment where I was like, wait, this could be what I want to do with myself, with my life. And it just went from there.
Okay, no, I think that's interesting that you said that. I follow African Style Archive, and it's been a couple of years since you started it, and, we'll go into its inception. But even now, I would say that there are very few platforms that are kind of like a place where you can go to find information about African style history. I think, a lot of it is depending on the researcher, the person who's interested, kind of pull pieces from different imagery, different sources in order for them to piece together the information that you're looking for. But with African Style Archive, that is a place where, someone knows that they can go to and find a ton of resources in this particular subject. So it's a great piece of archival history for everyone out there who's interested in learning more about style from the continent. So what was your inspiration behind founding African Style Archive? I know you talked a little bit about how you became interested in this particular subject area at the intersection of fashion and art, but what made you go, I want to start a platform to share this information with the world?
Right. So I think, like I said, I finished studying photography, and I actually started looking at the representation of everyday life and culture through photography, but in the Black British context. So I did some research at the Black Cultural Archives in London, in Brixton. And then naturally that came up because there's a huge African diaspora in the UK and in London, especially. Those kind of themes started coming up in my work and in my research for my master's dissertation. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to finish this how many thousand word, 15,000 word essay that I have to write. But I was finding loads of stuff about African fashion. I mean, not explicitly about African fashion, but I would look at this image about this person and be like, oh my God, this is really great. So I was kind of putting a pin in that whilst I was doing my research about, Black British photography and life and fashion. And I was like, I'm going to come back to that and see what happens with that and do more research into that independently. So yeah, after I completed that writing, I started looking into African fashion history some more. And I was just like, finding all these different like archives to look at, like visual sources, looking at the work of photographers, researching designers, looking at like costume and film. And I was just like kind of putting all of these together, making different files, buying books, doing all this research around it. And I was like, where is this going to go? And so I was like, I mean, what would be amazing is to write a book about it. But I think before a book happens, I have to make baby steps before that comes. So I'd actually like made the account in like 2019 or something, or maybe way before then, but I didn't posting it, and I just kind of had it there. And then it's like, oh, actually, I'm just going to just use this platform to share my research. And then I started sharing what I was finding on Instagram with captions and really just writing how I would want to learn about it as well. And
Mm.
yeah, I just kind of made it to just a space to just put my research, because doing it on a Word document was just like, it was just getting a bit, I need more. And yeah, that kind of started from there. And I really didn't think much would happen from it. I just was like, this is just a place that I'm going to just put my research, and whoever sees it, sees it. I really didn't have any big expectations from starting the platform. And that's kind of how it started. And also, I visited my grandmother, who lives in Ibadan in Nigeria. And she has this amazing like collection of photography as well, and all these different fabrics that,
Mm.
she wore. And she's actually 100 years old now. So,
Oh,
so
wow.
this is, yeah,
Congratulations to her. That's beautiful.
thank you on her behalf. But it's like, yeah, so she had all this amazing photographs of herself in her 20s, which was like 1940, pre-independence, post-independence, in Nigeria, like looking at those kind of the difference in fashion and what people wore and how people style things. And I was just looking at those from my family photos, and that kind of fed into the already existing research that I was doing. So yeah, it's kind of a combination of like family. Those photos inspired a lot, and also the things that I was naturally exposed to led me to start the platform and share my research.
And you said you started this around 2019 or 2020, sort of to share your research. How has it evolved since then? Because now, you're a consultant, you do a lot of work in this space specifically. So, what does African Style Archive look like today for you?
It's interesting because it started off being about looking at the work of how specifically African photographers depicted African people, and looking at studio portraiture. So studio photography from around the 60s, 70s, 50s even, because I really was like, it would be really great to show African people photographed by African people. That's kind of how it started off. So I was actually looking predominantly at studio photography. And then after, looking at a few archives and naturally being interested in like magazines, film, like I mentioned, it kind of started evolving, and I was expanding my curation and research to also sharing the works and looking at how African fashion has been represented in like vintage magazines as well, in music videos, in non-studio specific context as well. So like in like a kind of living everyday life and stuff like that. And yeah, so it's kind of evolved through that. So I guess expanding the medium in which I explore African fashion history and document that on the platform, that's evolved. But more recently, I would say also looking at what's been really interesting for me is actually visiting archives, because I started this project in, I guess, before COVID and lockdown happened. And with lockdown, I know we all know like we had at least a year or 2 years taken out where we couldn't visit libraries and archives and
Yeah.
stuff like that. So kind of just been opening up and stepping back into that space of actually visiting, apart from physical, like, archives of photography and working with like estates of photographers or their archivists, but also even looking at collectors as well that have really interesting material in their collection by collectors. I mean, it's very open. So it could be like fabric collectors, it could be, actual pieces collectors, so like actual clothing collectors by designers, just interesting makers that are doing interesting things with African fabrics, or using their Africanness and their heritage to tell stories with fashion and style and dress. So that's kind of that's how the platform, I guess, would have, I can say it's evolved, just because, there's just so many ways to tell stories about African fashion history. And what I find is there's no clear cut, straight way to tell stories about African fashion history compared to maybe
Right.
looking at, let's say you were going to study European fashion history, for example. You can find a book, but with what I found, it's like the books might not necessarily be like, this is a book about fashion. It could be a book about a country, for example. And then through looking at the book about the country or an ethnic group, then you kind of link these stories about, oh, this is the fabric that they wear, or this is a particular movement that started this and that. So yeah, I think just naturally evolved into being a more platform that shows how, African fashion also has evolved and is evolving through history as well. And I think, yeah, also footage has been really interesting and great in terms of storytelling. And I find that's one of the hardest part to find, to tell, to show this story, finding like archival footage that shows, a fashion show or, a designer's collection, because some of these histories have not been well preserved. But yeah, the platform has just
Right.
evolved to be this multimedia platform that tells stories about African sartorial history.
No, I can definitely relate to some of those same challenges. And I tell people all the time a lot of this research, especially when it comes to the Black and African diaspora and fashion, you have to find the fashion in the history. Whereas, like you mentioned, with some European fashion, you can go and you can get a book on, the different centuries and what they wore there and kind of study it very specifically. But with us, not so much. We really have to find the fashion in the history. So that's why, platforms like yours, the great resource for anyone who is out there searching, because they can really, you did all of the digging in a sense, so they can kind of focus on the fashion piece of it and learn more in that area. So, speaking more about your research, based on all of the things that you have looked up and you are continuing to dig into, who would you say are some of the pioneers of fashion on the continent of Africa?
I want to say it's subjective, but also it's kind of
For sure.
historical fact. If we were really going to go back to, and again, for me, I think there's a lot to be uncovered in terms of research, looking at pre-independence, like fashion history, but I think that's an area that I'm still exploring. So my perspective from this is coming from post-independence because that's what I've researched a lot more. But designers such as Chris Seydoux from Mali, I think he was definitely a pioneer and of fashion in Africa, and kind of bringing designers together and really introduced, like putting Bogle and fabric at the forefront. Umusi from Senegal as well. She was also a great pioneer and really kind of was an amazing, is still an amazing designer, and really just brought out a new way of looking at just like high fashion for Africa. And even with her like runway shows and her different collections and styling, Umu was really great in terms of pioneering. And this all was like around the 70s, 80s as well. So around 40 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
Patheo as well from Cote d'Ivoire. Pathio recently released book called Pathio. It's really stunning, and honestly, it's such a great resource to show Pathio's work as a pioneer in African fashion, because it talks about his textiles, his designs, all the models he worked with, really even like started making a real industry around models and making it a real profession by incorporating that into the scene in Abidjan. Alpha D as well, another great designer. I'm just going to be listing off designers at this point, but
No, I love
I'll
it.
stop. Alpha D as well from Niger. He founded like the International Festival of African Fashion and all of these different amazing movements. And what I love is that a lot of these designers, they supported each other and they showed up for each other. And so they really pioneered this like movement to really highlight and to celebrate and bring African fashion to the forefront many, many years ago, whilst it wasn't even being, I guess, massively recognized. So that, I guess, and among a list of many others, are pioneering designers of fashion on the continent. But right now, I think more contemporary, if I'm going to look at a more contemporary representation, I'm really loving what's coming out of South Africa at the moment. I love,
Okay.
that I love designers like Wanda Lefoto, Muso Maxwell, Lucanio Mdingi. I hope that's how I pronounce his name properly. Kebe Magugo as well. I feel like that, that collective and many more other designers really are like really making a real great collection and moment right now for African fashion. Yeah, and there's so many, many more others I could name, but I'm just gonna do
Right.
a little
No,
drop
that was
from
good.
them.
And it's so funny. Everyone that I've interviewed so far has really been loving the South African designers as well. Um, so there are a few that you named that I am familiar with, a lot that I'm not familiar with in on the contemporary designer side. So I'm going to make sure that I take some time and give a look because I definitely want to keep up with how African fashion is changing on a global scale and what people are bringing to it today. Because it's so diverse, and as you obviously know, you study it. Every country, every region has its own style,
Mm-hmm.
its own direction. So, from your research, have you seen any common themes when you think about different regions? And, themes could be like textiles, design techniques, anything like that that can kind of, tie an area together.
So I think within even the regions are so diverse. Like even looking at, let's say, with West Africa, for example, looking at the different countries, they're all very different in, even if we're looking at like, just culture and even language, obviously, but also within textiles as well. So I'm going to use Nigeria as an example. I'm Nigerian, so I think naturally I would just speak more about Nigeria. In Nigeria as a country, there's different ethnic groups. So, for instance, like looking at within the Yoruba people, they have like Adire cloth, which is like dyed cloth, and also Ashoke, which is like woven cloth. And this is within the same kind of ethnic group of Yoruba people, but there's so much
Right.
diversity in the kind of cloth that they have. And in even still on the topic of Nigeria, looking at another ethnic group, which is like the Igbo ethnic group, they also have Akwete cloth, George cloth, so many different kind of cloths that are all very different. So I think it's hard to kind of pinpoint if there's any kind of common themes because there's so much diversity. But then at the same time, I want to look at East Africa, looking at the Kanga cloth, which is a type of rectangular cloth and typically has motifs. It has a border like around the four corners. There's often repeated motifs or patterns and proverbs, sometimes in Swahili, and also sometimes printed images. But the Kanga cloth is worn commonly in Tanzania and also by people in Kenya as well. So I guess in that sense, there's kind of a common, like a shared cloth, but each kind of country would typically sometimes have their own different spin to it. So as much as there's diversity, there's also sometimes where it's kind of it transcends, I guess, borders and countries too. I think yeah, that's an interesting example for me off the top of my head right now.
Of the examples that you shared, or just others that you would have in the back of your mind, are there any of those particular textiles or techniques that you find most interesting or fascinating, just personally?
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to Ashoke again. And Ashoke is amazing, vibrant woven cloth that takes ages to make, I think, because of the different processes that is used to create it. I recently shared a post on African Style Archive actually about an Ashoke, amazing Ashoke collector that I met in on a recent trip to Dakar in Senegal. Her name is Eniola Dawadu, and she collects vintage Ashoke from the Yoruba land. And I just
Mhm.
really, I think just the way the fabric looks and the different, like, it's very vibrant and glistening. The way it's been created, essentially, like the process takes, different types of like weaving, and then you have to loom it and all these different things, and just really like bringing together different strip cloths and making it one thing. I think it's a really beautiful kind of, I won't call it a patchwork because it, it looks like finished and not a patchwork when it's done, but it's a very beautiful fabric. And the technique as well is very fascinating. I'm yet to see it happen in person, like actual when it's being done properly, but it's something that I
Right.
look forward to seeing on the next trip to Lagos or outside of Lagos in Nigeria as well. There's an amazing designer who is doing great things with Ashoke and has been for the last couple of years, who's Kenneth Ize, which I don't know if you know,
Yes.
Taniqua, maybe you do know. Yeah.
Yes. Of course.
Uh,
I think
yeah. And
everyone knows.
exactly. And there's other great designers who are doing, working with Ashoke as well. But particularly for Kenneth, for me, I love how he's really, used Ashoke and made it. I mean, it's always been the story of Ashoke is always, it was always a luxurious fabric that
Right.
was made into cloth for people, and kind of like before people started wearing it more. But when it first came out, it was like very expensive, so it was more the higher, the kings and the higher, the upper people in society, I guess, that wore them. So,
Yeah.
but the way he's kind of, made amazing clothing items out of it, like coats and dresses and jackets. I really love the time and the effort, and you can really see it when you do see, pieces from his collections of Ashoke when he especially started out making it first. Yeah, I think Ashoke is a really, really great fabric with really great stories.
Yeah, I'm actually have the opportunity to talk to Eniola later this month, so I'm really excited to get into more of the details and the techniques of Ashoke. I know growing up, I mean, my family's from Liberia, but my mom, that is like her favorite fabric, so she's always had just a ton of it around, or was always making clothing out of it. So it's been a huge part of my upbringing and my mother's personal style. So I definitely say that's one of my favorite things as well, or I guess one of the most interesting things for me as well, when it comes to African fashion. And I'm excited to learn just more about it, and more of the cultural significance as well.
Yeah, that would be great. And Eniola is such a wealth of knowledge, and she really, handles her practice with care, and it would be an amazing time speaking to her. But yeah, even just, I knew quite a bit about the fabric, but having visited her studio in Dakar and like talking through the different, ashoke she's collected over time, she sorts them out by like color, and even like we looked at some from the later periods that she's collected them and the earlier times. It's really, really amazing work she's doing with Ashoke. So I'm glad you're able to speak to her too.
You touched on this a little bit in your previous answer, so I want to go back to it. So you talked about, the Ashoke fabric being, something that was originally like designated for, I guess, the upper class people, and that kind of like leads me into this consistent thought or through line that I have about like a lot of African fashion, which is it is haute couture fashion. Like when I think about the definition of like French haute couture, like, it's the higher end type of like intricate technique and design. It's 9 times out of 10 custom made, like ready to wear isn't as available historically. Like, you would go to a tailor and you would get your clothing made. Even today, the large practice is to go to a tailor and get your clothing custom made to your style and to your fit and to your body. So I would love to hear your thoughts, or how would you define, African haute couture fashion? And do you view it in the same lens that I, just described?
It's unique to, Africans. And I think describing it has consistently evolved over time. But I think what drives it and what's really amazing about it is the different innovative ways that designers are working with fabrics and material, even like the ornamentation and incorporating that with different fabrics. So, even using like designers that are using like cowrie shells or using raffia on cotton fabric, it's really unique to Africa and it shows, I think. I've been seeing this really interesting work with different designers, how they, are reusing like rice bags or like
Mm,
sacks that, you used to buy beans in the like on the continent as well. These really colorful bags. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, right?
yes,
And even reclaiming like Ghana must go bags and you turning it into
right.
patterns, which what is what Wandela Photo does in his design. So I think it's in terms of the way Africans have shaped haute couture, I think it's really beautiful actually. And it's kind of, to me, it feels like a language that we understand. Obviously, if you're not
Mhm.
African, you can appreciate it, of course, and you can like it. But for me, what I find really beautiful is like seeing like something that is, I think, is so like a household staple, like a Ghana must go bag or something, and being like, oh, this person's been so clever to reclaim this and turn this into an amazing dress that will feel so chic and feel so glamorous. Or,
Right.
using fruit jewelry and really interesting things with that as well. So I think it's kind of, to me, it feels like a language that I know that not, obviously loads of people know, but when I see it, I'm like, this is this thing that I never would have in 1,000 years thought would be interesting to make into, I don't know, a great gown or dress or something. And someone has really put their stamp on it and made it really amazing and beautiful. So I really love that aspect of, really African high fashion and designs like that.
I completely agree. And it's interesting to see again how they bring like a different perspective to some of the everyday things of African culture and transform it into something that we look at as high fashion. Now, you have worked on a number of projects and, delivered a handful of lectures and just you are, the expert in this space. So, can you, for someone who is looking to kind of begin and learn more about African style, historical African style, can you share some of your resources that you've developed or some of your projects that you've worked on that would be a good starting place for a newcomer?
African Star Archive is a good place to start.
Of course.
It's on Instagram. It's on Instagram. So, the posts go all the way back. So that's a great, I think, resource to look through. And also I have a reading list that I've put on the link in the bio of African Star Archive, which actually has links to the actual PDF. So I've been able to find the free PDF. So it's still a growing list, but there's a few links to different articles on there and papers and journals and kind of even where to find some journals that are not free to necessarily access online, but it pinpoints you to where to get them from. So that's great. I think a really good resource to have. I wish I had that when I was studying, or just
Right.
even just not even studying, just finding out more about African fashion history. And I think another resource is with African Style Archive as well, is the actual physical library that I'm building. Or I don't have an actual physical space for the
Ooh.
library. I don't have an actual physical space at this point in time, but I have been collecting loads of books, loads of out of print magazines, record covers as well, related to African fashion and kind of visual culture as well. So that's a really interesting resource that I have at the moment. Though it's not public, but working on it becoming publicly accessible somehow. And also, most recently, linked to African fashion, I guess, and visual culture as well, is the magazine that I curated with luxury fragrance and beauty brand Byredo end of last
Yeah.
year, which was to celebrate the Bal d'Afrique fragrance. So I was invited to curate the magazine and consult on the magazine as well. And what I really like about the magazine is it has aspects of African fashion history, but also other, like I previously said, when you're looking at African fashion, you can't look at just one thing. You have to kind of look at other different mediums. So it was a really great
Right.
opportunity to bring all the different references that inspire me. So really even looking at like food, fashion, film, archives as well. We looked at the archive of an amazing photographer from Cote d'Ivoire, Paul Kojo, and feature some of his images in the magazine as well. So it was really great to build that resource that now exists, even though it was limited edition. So those that got copies, you have something great in your hand. But yeah, I mean, I think there's still so much more work to be done. But those are, for now, I think those are really great resources that exist from African Style Archive and the kind of the other wider work that I'm interested in as well.
I am so excited about the library that you mentioned. So I'm going to make sure that I'm staying tuned in, following along to watch the progress and be there when it finally becomes, a public resource. I think I kind of physical archival material, books, like magazines, all of that stuff is such a lost art form sometimes. When people think research, they immediately go to like typing online and finding things, and sometimes they're not there. Like you have to go out and dig into the world to see some
You
of this
really do.
information and read an actual book. So I'm excited to hear that. Again, best of luck on all of those things, and I'll be following along to make sure that I'm supporting your work there as well.
Amazing. Thank you.
Of course. So I want to switch gears a little bit and go into a few closing questions. I've been asking the guests that I've been interviewing this season because I'm interested in hearing the answers. And everyone's answers has surprised me, but also given me something to look up and to think about. So
Hmm.
I want to know if you're invited to an exclusive red carpet event, like what designer are you going to wear, or what stylist are you choosing to style you, either or?
Wow. This is a very hard question for me.
I've had people just run a list of designers too. So if it's multiple, that's fine.
The first design that came to my head was Christopher John Rogers. I think if I'm
Oh,
feeling
love.
like, I don't know, maybe something custom, maybe not. I love everything Christopher John Rogers does, anyways. But the assignment will be understood with that. So that would
For sure.
be great. I also quite like Iman Ayisi's, kind of very minimalist designs, but they're still like very statement as well. So Iman Ayisi would be another designer. Another one designer that I'm loving right now is Tolu Koka. She's British Nigerian. I would love to work on, I don't know, I think we could make something together if I had to walk a red carpet event. Yeah, those are the three off the top of my head right now.
Great, great choices. Three that I love myself. So great, great choices. I think they all kind of bring a statement in a different way.
Mm,
So
yeah,
you would
yeah.
definitely stand out. Okay. What is something in your personal like archive or collection that people would find interesting or surprising?
Do you mean like in my clothes or just in general?
Clothes or in general, whichever you feel
I
comfortable
think
sharing.
clothes for me, I've realized, I think the amount of duplicate clothing that I own. So by duplicate, I mean I own a lot of things in the same style, same everything, but different color. And I just kind of have a uniform unintentionally, but like if I like a specific style of clothing or designer, I will just buy the same thing but in different colors. Or it could be like they have a
For sure.
short sleeve version, long sleeve version, pattern version, but ultimately it's the same shape. I would have like 10 pieces from one designer, but they're all like literally different colors, but just different lengths. And I do that quite a lot. I realized I was sorting out my wardrobe the other day and I have like same pair of jeans but in three different colors, and I have like, yeah, a jacket version of a dress but it's the same color, same material. I don't know if that's good or bad. I think
No,
it
I
saves
mean, look,
time
if
when
you
I have to
like it,
think.
you buy it.
Yeah, so I think if I like one thing I would just have it in different colors basically. So you know, it's effective, it saves time to think and you just know what works for you. So yeah, I think the amount of repeated items.
Yeah, it's definitely effective. I think it's a surefire way to make sure that you always look nice because you always have something that you know works for you and that you know you like, and throw it on and go about your day.
Exactly that.
Okay. And then for my final question, reflecting on your journey as a curator and fashion historian, do you feel like you have, made strides in your mission to preserve, document, and celebrate, African style history?
I think I have made a little bit. I think I've just made a dent. I think there's more work to be done, but I think I'm a very ambitious person, a little bit delusional sometimes, but I think we all need a bit of delusion to make things happen.
Absolutely.
I think I've made strides, yes. I think in the sense that I think the platform has got this reception and engagement that I didn't not necessarily think it would have, because for me it was always like, I'm really obsessed with this topic, I'm passionate about this topic, and I'm just going to share with the world that I'm obsessed with it. That's how it kind of started. But I think I've succeeded, but I think there's way more to come that I'm looking forward to doing. So I'm really excited about that, and then that will feel like a bigger success in terms of broadening access to African fashion history, but also, just really making and sharing more with the world, because there's way more stories to be told and way more
Right.
things to learn about in terms of African fashion history. And yeah, there's more to come.
For sure. Well, I so appreciate your work as a historian and all of the resources and things that you have shared as you've discovered them. It's been extremely helpful to me in my own journey of learning more about Black style globally. So thank you. And I look forward to seeing all of the other things that you do and all the other information that comes out of your work. And then, of course, thank you for being on the podcast. I really appreciate your time and all of your knowledge. And I know my audience is going to glean a lot from this episode. So please share with everyone, anything that you have coming up next that we should look forward to, that we should be following along for, so that we can support you in all your endeavors, and of course share where we can find you online.
Yeah, I'm online at African Style Archive on Instagram. Yeah, stay tuned to for more exciting things to come with the platform, and even doing like physical things in person as well. And yeah, African Style Archive is on Insta, and also my personal Instagram, where I kind of bridge my love for fashion as well, is at Motown underscore gal, GAL, not GIRL. on Instagram. I'm also always open to, people that are interested in, if they have, book collections that they think might be interesting to this research, or kind of any kind of familial stories that they have to share as well. Those kind of submissions are always of interest to me. And so, yeah, I'll be happy to hear from anyone about that as well.
Okay, well, everyone, make sure you follow Tosin online and support all things African Style Archive. And thank you again for joining us. I really appreciate the conversation. And that's it, guys. Make sure you check the show notes for a direct link to all of the resources that I use for today's episode. If you love today's episode or any episode, make sure to give us a 5-star review on Apple. It takes you all of 2 seconds, but it really, really counts towards helping this show reach more people and more Black fashion enthusiasts like you. And if you haven't done so already, follow us on all social media at Black Fashion History Podcast so you can keep up with all things Black fashion history. And the most important thing, if you do nothing else, come back next week and join me for another riveting installment of Black Fashion History.